Yes, it's recording. Excellent. All right,
Yeah.
let's begin. And really, before we begin, um, I just want to say, as we gather for this meeting, physically discussed and virtually constructed, I want us to take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and doing so recognize the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, and especially any who are in the room today, of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. So I thank you all for being here for the final session of this of WSR. It's good to see a room full of people. So for this panel session, it's mainly reporting from one project, and different presentations will speak to that. So I'll give you a very quick overview of the panel topic here. And that is, this is a ARC funded research that examines Australian strategies for living well with religious diversity in legislation, education, migration, policing, and interfaith initiatives. Religious diversity produces both challenges and creative opportunities in each of these spheres, and we have sort of like different presentations will cover these different aspects or streams, as we call it. Social policy and everyday responses to diversity reflect a complex set of intersecting factors in which policy initiatives are interwoven with the particularities of histories, ethnicities, and religious cultures. And so we aim to present early findings out of the studies here. And we will pretty much go accordingly what you're seeing on the program, which is Gary will start off. Next will be Anna and myself, then Geraldine, and finally Doug and Beck will take charge of the last presentation. Each of us will have 15 to 20 minutes. I think we're just, I'll keep time. I will private message all of you where you're at with time. And then because, while we're all kind of like speaking into different aspects of the project, we can do like a final Q&A at the end. If in the interim, any of you have any questions, feel free to pop it into your chat. If not, at the end of the session, we can just do an open mic sort of thing. I think I have covered everything. So maybe over to you then, Gary.
Thank you, Enqi, and like you, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I pay my respect to the elders past and present, of the owners and keepers and tenders of the land, and the rich religious diversity that preceded us, surrounds us, and shall go on beyond us. Okay, I'm going to report on about 5 to 6 years of research into religious diversity in Australia, which I've done largely as part of the project that Enqi referred to, led by Doug Ezzy, and including others, many of them on the panel today. And as a demographic approach to religious diversity, largely seeing religion as religious identity. Yes, there are a whole variety of other ways of doing it, but the Australian census provides us with rich data centered on people's response to what's your religion? And that's been there, and it's lovely. And I've called it like a horse race for many, many years. And since 2016, I really dug in. The first thing was to do a cross-national comparison. And in that, I discovered that Australia is unique in the world, having 5 significant groups other than the dominant group. And dominant group in Australia, yes, are Christians by the skin of their teeth, a majority in only 2 states. Elsewhere, we Christians are a minority, part of the minorities. The 5 groups are Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, and Jews. Sikhs having really risen to substantial size and strong community presence from between 2011 and 2016. and have become more numerous than Jews in that time. And that sets us apart from any other country I could find. Most other countries have one larger group. In England, it's Muslims. In France, it's Muslims. Germany, it's Muslims, etc. So that diversity in that gross sense at a national level is distinctive for Australia. And then Anna and I did a much more detailed analysis of Australia's diversity, religious diversity, but still looking at the national level, but looking at the more recent changes and discovering the very substantial rise of nuns, of course, as it was in the last census, and the Pentecostals. And the Pentecostals get enumerated in very interestingly different ways, and there can be much contestation about how many there are. But in my counting of them, looking under his various rocks and other places in the census, their numbers are larger than the Pentecostals, which is interesting in itself, because if you're a Pentecostal, your chances of going to church are about 500 times more than if you say you are Uniting or Anglican. But so it's a very substantial religious community, which to my mind still doesn't get the kind of analytical attention that such a community of that size warrants. British Protestantism is declining very substantially. And again, that was very interesting. But that led to me working with three other Monash demographers, Dharma and Ernest Healy and Alan Gamlen, to take the focus down from a national level. You see interesting things at a national level, but I began much more as I was moving around and meeting people, becoming aware of regional and intra-urban differences. And so the first layer of comparison was that we compared capital cities in terms of the index of dissimilarity of religious groups. Now, the index of dissimilarity says what percentage of this particular group would have to move in order for its distribution to be like that of evenly distributed across the community. And for example, in Sydney, Buddhists have an index of, higher it is, the more clumped and the more ghettoized you are, if you want to put it that way. In Sydney, Buddhists are 36%, and the most clumped group in Sydney, they are most clumped is Sydney of the capital cities in Australia. Christians have low figures like 5 in Brisbane and 4 in Perth and 4 in Adelaide. So they're widely distributing, find one anywhere. Hindus are much more clumped with a figure of 47 for Sydney, 33 for Melbourne. Muslims are quite clumped as well. Clumped group are Jews in Melbourne at 73.9. And we've known that for a very long time. And that's largely due to schools, shops, synagogues, and the clumping in at Caulfield. So that was one way of beginning to look at the diversity of diversities in the country, Australia. But when we looked at that and we did this analysis then at that analysis and this one at the SA2 level, which is the neighborhood level that the census recommends. And I used to use postcode, but postcodes have gone out of fashion, and SA2s, which are roughly 2,000 to, they average 10,000 people. They vary from 2,000 to 20,000, but mostly they're about 10,000 and are supposed to reflect functioning communities in a particular region. And so we did an SA2 analysis of Melbourne. And it was very interesting to see where there was greater and lesser diversity, not dissimilarity now, in terms of the number of religious identities in each of the SA2s of Melbourne. there was quite a patchwork. Of course, there was no SA2 with fewer than 50 religious identities, and there were many with well over 200, and that was spread all over the place. But there began to emerge particular zones that might be of interest. There was no place where you could say, oh, there's a hugely diverse place, but the diversity was a little bit more here and there. And we wanted to know, okay, what is behind that sort of gross religious identity nomination, in the sense is, what else do we know about these communities? And so we identified 4 SA2s in particular, 4 areas, to become much more finely grained about what happened between 211 and 216 in terms of movement in, movement out, who's there, when. A fascinating study producing very, very many highly complex transition matrices, which I could fill the screen with, but it wouldn't inform you much, except there's an awful lot of numbers and people going all over the place. I had some colorful charts, but you needed a magnifying glass to, almost a microscope, to read them. But the 4 areas that we looked at were Broadmeadows area, Wyndham, Brunswick, and Box Hill. And each one of those produced very, very different patterns of religious diversity. So that if you talked about Australia as diverse, well, okay, fine, yeah, true. Melbourne is diverse, sure, fine, true. But hey, look, underneath that, there's vastly more diversity happening at the very local community level. And I think that's got all kinds of implications for everything. So we looked at religious composition, and yes, quite very different between these 4 groups, but looked at migration in and out. Who came in, who went out, and then also within the suburb, who moved within the suburb, where, and who moved. So we had people coming in. What nation did you come in from? Many did. What did you come in from out of state? After all, Melbourne was a net recipient of some nearly, well over 500,000 people between 211 and 216. Who were they? Well, they're very differently spread over the city. The recency of migration, were these older settled suburbs or more recent suburbs? Yes, we know more about it now, and you could probably guess a lot of it, but to have the detail about who's there and who's living cheek by jowl with who else in a suburb, finding their way forward, buying their groceries, working their lives out in the context of diversity, live diversity, was what we were looking at. And so, and we have that picture. And so, starting with Broadmeadows, of course, we know that Broadmeadows has a substantial Levantine population, and much of it has been there for several generations, and it has been growing in its density with schools and shopping and all of that growing, but that isn't all. There's a lot of other migration alongside of that, and so the diversity within that diversity, and then there's movement within Broadmeadows. It isn't a real suburb, but we discovered people would move from Broadmeadows Low to Broadmeadows Heights. And it was fascinating to see how these patterns would emerge over just a 5-year period in Broadmeadows. So we called it the Levantine Gateway Enclave because it was somewhat of an enclave, but it was also, people were moving in and out of Broadmeadows all the time as well, following what Bob Birrell and his team called residential churning in Melbourne. There's a great deal of residential movement all of the time, and that churning keeps moving people around. I've only lived here 40 years, and I mean, I can remember when Pran was very, 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 very Greek, and then Pran got gentrified, and all these people moved out to Wheelers Hill and and other such places. Anyway, so. That mobility of people within, between, and around, just in 5 years, has been fascinating. Wyndham was the second place we looked, and it has received a very large proportion of the South Asian migration to Melbourne, and in fact to Australia. during that time. And it's a very, very new suburb. And the concerns about how are people finding their way in that suburb, what kinds of services are emerging, all of that. Other parts of this study are looking at that, but the whole business of how this is being negotiated, and with the backdrop fear, but as yet no evidence to support it, will the conflict between Hindu and Muslim in South Asia be imported to Australia? Or will people negotiate a completely different, more peaceful way to live together and find their way forward here? And that's one of the challenges in that particular area, but a very interesting religious composition, which if you pushed it back, well, if you pushed it back 20 years, you'd be open fields. So it's very new, very fresh, very, very diverse. But then we discovered, okay, yeah, those two obvious places are interesting, but what's going on in sort of not so far out from the center, what's happening toward the center? And so we picked Brunswick, what's happening in Brunswick? And again, a vast amount of churning as people move in and out of Brunswick. Yes, probably large numbers of students, but that's interesting in itself. Very high rates of no religion, but a whole variety of other things going on, so that the diversity is real and vibrant and changing over time. Amazingly, we referred to Brunswick as a cosmopolitan hipster village because it was young. It was very much university style, people moving in and out, but there are also people staying. It is gentrifying, and in that gentrification, it's a different flavor of people than we're gentrifying somewhere else. And so again, it has its flavor and a rich part of that diversity. Finally, the fourth one that we looked at, of course, was Box Hill. And again, so to say that further out has diversity, but inside doesn't, is madness. The diversity in Box Hill has been huge, and we refer to Box Hill area as the Asian turnover villages, as there's been a huge purchasing of homes, etc., in that area by Chinese buyers. Who have been told that because the tail of the Dandenongs comes down to that point, the feng shui is perfect. So, and besides which, they were large blocks you could do all sorts of things with, and they were savvy buyers and snapped things up and have done reasonably well. Although I'm told it has one of the highest rates of non-resident owners, empty houses, but that's not religious. They'll declare themselves as religious. But again, the change has been dramatic and has produced change in the commercial area and in religious and spiritual life of the area, and in the way that these things are governed and negotiated and worked out by people. And so looking again at that narrower focus is terribly important. I live in Stonington, and I did a small study in addition to this of Stonington, and the diversity that's been produced by this huge array of high-rise apartments has been stunning. And all of a sudden there's all these youth, and churches were saying, well, there are no youth in this town anyway. They're all old. Who can afford to live here anyway? I said, look out your window, Charlie, or Geraldine, as you wish. Again, looking at the diversity, nothing stays fixed in Melbourne. Residential churning will move things around anyway. And so just profound differences wherever you put the attention in terms of composition, recency of migration, source of migration, local culture, economics, and all of that, all of which will play into any efforts to produce real social cohesion, that is, community working together at a local level to solve issues. I would love to have a post-COVID analysis of how these communities have dealt with the challenges of this last year, and how people have worked across this. And how there was a lovely article in the Age and online about South India, I think it was South Asian women. No, it was in Africa, African women cooking up vast slabs of food. The Sikhs have been doing it. This feeding it doesn't know an ethnic border, it doesn't know a religious border. How is that going? Well, there has been a little bit of Anglican feeding, I'm told, out of St. Peter's Eastern Hill, but these emergent groups coming out of, so the basic message out of all of this is, if you're going to engage in trying to promote respectful inter-religious relations, you have to work at the neighborhood level. Yeah, you can talk to the head office. Well, sure, they don't talk to the neighborhood level. They don't know what's going on. They're totally out of touch. We've learned that. Neighborhood level is terribly important, both in terms of interrelations of people. What are the issues going on? How are new structures emerging? What is it looking like? What are people building? And honoring these emergent things as part of a rich, diverse religious culture, which is living together and producing the capacity to live very well together in diversity, a rich diversity that is beyond the imagination of most other places in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. That's really fascinating in terms of like the amount of changes, like just even within the time that you've been in Melbourne, and that's really interesting. And thanks for setting that up, I guess, for the rest of us to sort of unpack different parts of what that looks like on the ground. So I believe it's Anna and myself.
Last thing in a little while.
Let me just. Oh, fancy screen. Hang on, I need to keep time. Right. So we're really, Anna and I will be reporting from the migration stream of the project. Greg was initially supposed to present this segment, so he sends his apologies. All right. I guess a bit of a background of some of the communities that we have researched. So 5 main groups: the Chinese, the Indian, the Russian, the Afghan, and the African diaspora communities. We selected both sort of more established communities as well as the more emerging and newer communities here. A total of 55 interviews were done, mainly with community leaders, but a whole mix of some from religious backgrounds, some not. We were mindful in making sure like we included women as well as youth and stakeholders, stakeholders from government or policymakers that are that have a hand in thinking through some of the policies when it comes to migration or multicultural services. And because for this project we're looking across Victoria and Tasmania, these are sort of like the we collected 55 interviews across both of these states. So Anna and Greg pretty much led this aspect of the project, the migration stream, and Sumi is working on this project as well. So is William Abor, and my role is pretty much interviewing the community. Anna did some interviews as well. And these are some of the other people on the project. So we actually have quite a huge team, lots of expertise, with even Danielle Campbell, who is in Tasmania as a research consultant, and we have various RAs as well as part of the project, Jerry and Emily, who is not present today. And Jerry is part of the interfaith aspect of this project, and she'll speak about that a little bit later. So I should say that when we went into the field and we wanted to collect data, that was kind of when COVID-19 hit us. So we did maybe 2 interviews, and then COVID happened. We had to scramble and quickly change and shifted into online interviews pretty much. And I think as part of the pandemic, and you would have heard about it in the news a lot as well, migrant communities especially are affected significantly, because of various issues such as the kind of employment that they were in, the precarity around their kind of employment. And so they're pretty much at, I suppose, more at risk in that sense. But when we were talking to the community, we were talking to religious groups, we were able to see a lot of community-led responses. And some of these community organizations themselves are so, they don't really have a lot of funding. Like they didn't have, like piecemeal funding from the government sometimes to just supplement what they're doing. But a lot of times there's a lot of not just physical labor into providing for their own communities and other communities, but also a lot of emotional labor in that whole endeavor of making sure that their own communities as well as the wider Australian communities are, being provided for during this pandemic. So we did speak to some international students. We did talk to some people who are in more precarious or employment who were particularly hit by the pandemic for various reasons, like citizenship or visa could be issues that are factors in contributing to that sort of precarity. So even though there are some government benefits like rent relief or the job seeker, there are still criteria around it that there's still a gap where who can or cannot receive these sort of benefits. I think probably that will be. So I guess just thematically talking through what we saw was happening, but also in speaking to our participants, like I said, a lot of assistance, a lot of welfare provision, whether it's just the immediate needs like food, accommodation, doing the translation work amongst religious and community groups, but also even within like spiritual groups, there is that sort of not just shift towards digital practices. I think maybe a lot of you will have got onto like yoga practices. I know I did. Religious groups as well have jumped on board into making that digital shift. And that digital shift does not necessarily, it is not just, implemented by bigger organizations. Even the smaller ones are able to just, jump on using Zoom. So there's been a lot of that shift happening that we saw right away. And that was really interesting for us in sort of thinking that through a little bit further. I just want to point out that there were also various aspects of discrimination and racism that was sort of exacerbated during the pandemic. And in speaking to the communities, especially the Chinese and the Black African communities and the Afghan communities as well, there were these racism and discrimination sort of comes in ebbs and flows, whether just in their everyday experiences, or for the Chinese community, especially during a pandemic, just sort of like that everyday encounter, but also as, for the Black African community, it's a lot to do with employment issues, facing discrimination and employment issues, and that was already happening pre-COVID, and during COVID, it sort of like made everything worse for them. So that was something that came up quite a bit. We also started noticing, I think especially Anna might want to speak to that a little bit further, is that there were a lot of conspiracy theories that were sort of like bubbling up within these wellness groups. And along with that shift to digital platforms, I suppose that proliferation of weird theories, or that blends science and pseudoscience, just sort of all come together into this great mix of things. So this was really a conversation piece that Anna led, and was published on, that sort of helped us start thinking in terms of like what are religious and community groups doing during the lockdown quite early on when it all happened, how, people are generally quite open to embracing technology and jumping on board to digital platforms and rethinking their practices, rethinking religious practices. But there's still that gap in terms of people still crave community. And I think we've kind of, previous session kind of addressed that a little bit as well. So I think that's me. And over to Anna, really.
Thank you, Enqi. So in addition to what Enqi said, we also more recently wrote a piece on conspirituality. We did not invent that term, but we did put the brackets around the con. If we have time in the questions, we can talk about that more. But in terms of the migration study, I just want to focus in on one particular section. It's actually quite a large study. What has been really important is we've also looked at the history of all of those communities and discovered, again, this rich diversity and very long history in Australia, well before the introduction of the 1901 White Australia policy. Gary has done some amazing data generation for us from the census in terms of country of birth. And so we have this incredible sort of data set in terms of not just the size of the populations, but their employment status, their citizenship status, the types of jobs and industries that they're in. And therefore, when we look at COVID, that's really helping us to see sort of areas of precarity. We've actually just written a piece around that for a Journal of Contemporary Migration, and we are finishing a piece for Ibrahim's special issue of the JASR on New African diaspora communities. So I'm just going to hone in a little bit on belonging, whiteness, and the multicultural real, in terms of our theoretical approach to this study. So having a sense of belonging is acknowledged as a basic need and equated with feeling at home and feeling safe in a place and or community. So belonging can be multiple and is best understood through an intersectional lens, including social locations of ethnicity, race, religion, and gender. Citizenship, the right to work, and access to services and material resources also deeply impact upon a sense of belonging, and a lack of belonging can have severely negative effects on a person's well-being and mental health, including alienation, depression, and insecurity. Developing a sense of belonging is thereby an effective, multi-layered, dynamic process informed by everyday encounters and practices. And I'm drawing here very much on the work of the scholars listed here, Antonish, Yuval Davison, about to get to Ghassan Hard. So this sense of belonging, both individual and at the community level, exists alongside what Nero Yuval Davies calls nationalist political projects of belonging that are conflated with citizenship and a conditional sense of belonging within a nation state. National belonging has been framed through a lens of shared values where people's belonging has been increasingly judged by others, resulting in hierarchies of belonging. So according to Fosder and Hartley, closer to home, civic belonging in Australia is progressively achieved through the approval of various hurdles such as English proficiency and citizenship tests. And scholars argue that these tests have long been ethnicized. They are Eurocentric and informed by Judeo-Christian interpretation of Australian values, making them more challenging for people from non-English speaking, non-Christian and non-white backgrounds. As Anton Sitch explains, dominant groups equate belonging with a rhetoric of sameness, and there might always remain other dimensions, e.g. place of birth or skin color, this is a quote, sorry, which would prevent full sameness and therefore expose the person to discourses and practices of social spatial exclusion, unquote. So we think this is well illustrated in Ghassan Haj's White Nation, where he argues that whiteness is a crucial component of Australianness, where white Australians view themselves as governors of the nation and Indigenous and ethnic Australians as passive objects to be governed and moved or removed according to a white national will. These unequal power relations established in colonial times persist to this day and are even reproduced in policies and practices of multiculturalism. according to Haj. He also argues that whiteness and Australianness can be accumulated up to a certain point, and people can be said to be more or less white and Australian. However, white people who embrace the white nation fantasy do not differentiate between migrants according to whether they are from non-English speaking backgrounds or not, but rather primarily on how they look. So Haj further explains that in this white nation fantasy, the migrant presence is perceived as one that poses problems. However, this fantasy is disconnected from what he calls the multicultural real, where everyday interaction between diverse cultures is largely unproblematic and pervasive, as Gary noted earlier. So moreover, non-white Australians fought very hard for representation and for an active role in governance, resulting in multicultural policies. And Haj argues that, quote, the real fear of those inhabiting this fantasy is directed towards the aggressively independent and political non-whites, the Aboriginal people and the migrants who deploy an Australian will outside the supervisory tentacles of white governmentality, unquote. So, you know, what we're seeing now is that Australia and the world are experiencing a rise in populism centred on exclusionary nationalism, and whiteness continues very much to inform and construct ethnic and religious minorities as others within Australian media and political discourses. So in contrast to popular opinion, Haj proposes that the antidote to white nationalism in Australia lies in the direction of a deeper commitment to a far more reaching multiculturalism rather than shying away from it. And similarly, Yuval Davis notes that the politics of belonging includes not only state creation and maintenance of boundaries, but also their contestation and challenge by other political agents. Local and transnational social, political and or religious identities, communities and movements can thereby contest these national boundaries. And instead, she proposes an alternate feminist political project of belonging centered on an ethics of care, interpersonal relationships and common human values, rights and responsibilities rather than national ones. So this is very much how we're like approaching and framing our study. And if we can just move to the next slide, I have a few just quotes here from our participants. So please read them. I'm not going to read through them, but what you can see in every single one of these slides is this kind of ambivalence, that there's definitely a pervasive racism in Australia, and that definitely has an impact on people's sense of belonging. But at the same time, there is this, we've used the word resilience. I'm not entirely comfortable with that term, so I think we're still playing with that. But what you see is this agency, and as Haj mentioned, you know, this representation, this forming of associations, this having a public voice, and we see this across all of the communities, and that is the multicultural real. That is very much still alive and well, and probably even getting stronger in Australia. So I think that's probably long enough on that slide. The next two slides are from African diaspora communities. So once again, this, you know, really pervasive and quite heartbreaking, some of these quotes. Again, as Enqi mentioned, in terms of access to employment or access to opportunities, as the last quote mentioned, the bamboo ceiling for Asian communities, several participants spoke about that. And again, this newer community, relatively speaking, South Sudanese professionals setting up this association, becoming very active in sort of seeing these problems and wanting to address them, and successfully beginning to do so, and particularly with the emphasis on young people. Fatun Farah from the East African Women's Foundation, again, you know, her own personal experience then inspired her to create this association to then help women, especially with acquiring English language and employment ready skills. And in this particular quote, she speaks about how actually, I mean, that's a really interesting thing we learned with the African diaspora community, is that whether it's a well-established community like the Mauritians or the Ghanaians, or whether it's the newer communities, they're largely working in the health sector. So whether it's hospitals, aged care, childcare, and then also as I think it was taxi drivers and something else, meatworks. So, you know, all of those industries were very much in the front line, very much impacted. And so her quote is demonstrating how active her community was in helping, and how, you know, successful they were in helping on the ground. And yet what happened? The media, you know, misrepresented them or focused on negative things about the virus spreading and didn't report on the incredibly positive and important contributions that these communities have been making, are still making as frontline workers. And then the final one, the data really is incredible. I mean, it's really rich data. So Gula Bazan from the African Women's Association in Victoria, and I think, you know, this is a very moving kind of disturbing quote. But once again, you know, she's not giving up, she's not giving in. She's, you know, resistance, I think, is maybe a better word than resilience. Resilience, I was actually in a meeting with Yin Paradies the other day. He's an Indigenous Studies scholar at Deakin, and we were really saying we have a bit of a problem with this word resilience. But yeah, resistance maybe is better. But again, you know, despite the resistance, the problems are still there. So just finally summing up. So I think retelling of this history to me just seems to be the most important thing. The White Australia policy rewrote the narrative, you know, like it's a socially constructed myth, a racist socially constructed myth that was there, put in place for 70 years. What actually happened beforehand, as Gary can attest, in census data, and as we have found in our examination of history, and Enqi and I've done some really fascinating work even before this study or parallel to this study on the history of Buddhism in the far north. I mean, it's amazing, right? This long history of Chinese, Japanese, Sri Lankan, African communities, Russians up there as well. Diversity within. So again, instead of looking at Muslim, Hindu, you know, Christian groups, we've looked at the ethnic groups and we've matched this incredible religious diversity like within the groups, and then how they negotiate that, which has also been really fascinating, including the religious nuns. This persistent racism and exclusion, very much, you know, going back to that myth or even before the myth. But at the same time, as we've mentioned, this persistent resistance and resilience, agency, representation, and setting up of their own cultural, religious, spiritual institutions. So yeah, retelling this history and focusing and foregrounding the multicultural real, truth-telling, recognizing harm, healing. Ibrahim said something the other day about restorative practices, and Gillian Tan was talking this morning about regenerative practices, and Paul Hedges was talking about the colonial wound yesterday. So I think this is it, like we have to actually name these wounds and name the pain and expose all of that in order to actually be able to somehow yeah, continue to sort of work with it and resist it and put forward a different reality in place of this very hurtful myth. Yeah, that's it.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I think I might not have kept time very well for Alice, but it's Jerry next with 20 minutes of. So Jerry will be presenting from her PhD, I believe, on interfaith and young people.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here on your Saturday afternoon. So I've been doing the interfaith stream of the Religious Diversity Project. And broadly, what my project is about is looking at how interfaith organisations and the people that work within them are facilitating encounters of difference and building relationships between religious communities. And I've been looking at Sydney, Hobart and Melbourne, and talking to people within those cities. And a big part of this project is attending interfaith events and seeing what kind of practices, rituals or language is used to create an environment where people can come together and have an experience where they go, oh, I didn't know that about that person, and oh, now I understand these groups a bit better. But I want to focus today on something that I noticed in attending these events, is that there's not a lot of young people. So I'm a young person, and I really stood out. Like there would only be a handful of people under 35 at these events. And this is quite strange. I wanted to find out why this was. And the funny thing is that interfaith organisations are very interested in young people. They have done a lot of advocacy for supporting young people, and they want these young people to come up and succeed them. Because what I found in my interviews is that a lot of people in these organisations are tired, and they want to, they've been doing it for so many years. They need more people coming in. So this is actually quite a problem. And so I kind of thought, you know, if I try and figure out what's going on, then that might be quite helpful. So just to clarify, so there may be a few young people hanging around, but I think what I want to get at is more meaningful participation. So young people in leadership positions. And so I want to talk about 2 organisations that are led by young people that are real exceptional in this area. And I want to talk why they've been successful and what they've done differently. So this is some of the observations from my interviews when I asked, why is there no young people? One person said, well, we try and bring them in, but someone in the room won't listen to them. And so that person kind of feels like, what's the point of being here? I'm not being listened to. Someone said, well, as a young person, you feel like your voice is secondary. And another observation was that, well, the thing is that a lot of kids or young people don't really have a very mainstream view of their religion. So it's a bit hard for them to get involved with interfaith because they've got such a mixture of ideas about the world. And what was also pointed out is that for a lot of young people, they don't really know how to interact with each other as religious people or as spiritual people. It's kind of a bit taboo. It's not really the thing that people in millennials or Generation Z really want to talk about. So that was kind of another sense. And I really like this quote is, baby boomers, they just don't get it. Apparently interfaith dialogue was a thing of their time, but you come to our time and it's not. So there's a different focus for millennials and Generation Z. And so this is also reflected in the data. So the AGZ study, interaction study, and the RGSY study. So what they kind of pointed out is, well, young people have very hybrid religious identities. They're gathering lots of different sources, and they're kind of creating these assemblages of ideas and worldviews and practices like meditation and so on. A lot of people are spiritual, some people are non-religious. So the point is that there's not a lot of kind of single affiliation, belonging, kind of unambiguous full membership. It's a bit all over the place. And the other thing is that they've grown up in a time where religious institutions are under a lot of scrutiny. So there's a bit of taboo about it, or a bit of prejudice towards religion. And I also want to point to this last point here is that what I found interesting reading these studies is that the interview participants are saying that, we really value religion and religion is important, but, we feel uncomfortable about the attitudes towards gender and sexuality, diversity, and feel a bit uncomfortable with the clash of rights, the LGBTQI and between religious rights. And I want to come back to this point. So why is this? What has this got to do with interfaith? Well, I think that a lot of interfaith in scholarship and in practice, it operates under this dialogue model. So there's a lot of exceptions to this, but I think this is a very strong way of thinking about interfaith that has impacts on who it includes and who it excludes. So the dialogue model is basically a religious leader or someone who is educated in their religious tradition goes and talks to someone else who is educated in their religious tradition. And together they discuss the theological points or the ideas within their traditions. They find commonalities and differences. But the thing is that they are speaking as representatives. So they're not talking as individuals, what I believe. It's about, well, in my tradition, this is the case. So first off, that's already kind of limits who can participate, because you need to be learned enough to engage. You need to be given a certain legitimacy by the institution, so you can't be some marginal random person who just goes along and is the representative. You kind of have to have the right backing. And it makes it a lot about searching for truth, so it's a very logocentric way of going about it. And you can kind of see this dominating idea in the way that a lot of the interfaith activities are described as dialogue. So things like this Leonard Swidler's kind of in his dialogue decalogue, he talks about dialogue of the head, so that's theological discussions, of the heart, of the hands and the holy, so forming friendships, working collaboratively on social issues, talking about or sharing in religious experiences, which I would argue they're not necessarily dialogue, these are practices, these are things that are being done and lived. So, so that's why I think it excludes young people, is that it's not really for, this dialogue model isn't really for those at the margins. You've got to really have that legitimacy of the institution. And it also excludes other groups as well, so women or LGBTQI. So I really liked discovering these organisations, Interaction and Youth Power, because they took a completely different route. So Interaction isn't quite active now, but when it was led by young people. They partnered with Father Bob and would take food to public housing. They would run these retreats where they'd just bring people together so that they could learn and talk to each other and find out about each other's experiences. I think they did a lot of education programs, so they were very active, and it was very much based on action. So I think one of their slogans was common action for the common good. And so Youth Power, that's an upcoming initiative of the Columban Centre of Christian Muslim Relations in Sydney. And they have been active for a few years, and what they've done recently is they've had 4 events of forums, youth forums in different parts of Sydney, where you could go along and talk about your vision for the interfaith future. So they have this goal called creating the Sydney Statement, and it's an interfaith charter that's written for Sydney or by Sydney-siders and young people who are like religiously diverse. And I think that's coming out soon, but the focus is bringing young people together just to start forming those relationships. And in talking to Ryan Aponulin, who is the youth coordinator for Youth Power, there are plans to move into a more social action focus. So I want to kind of point to these because they've been quite successful, because I think they've moved away from a dialogue model and into a more about forming friendships, learning about each other, and collaborating on social issues. Because doing that, it really opens the door for people that may be non-religious or spiritual or kind of a mixture of different things at the margins of their religious tradition. And it says, well, you don't need to have a perfect understanding of your tradition. You don't need to have a perfect understanding of any tradition. You can just come as you are and you can participate, and you're welcome. And I really love this quote from Nivi, who's co-founded Interaction, who I interviewed. And she said, oh, it's not meant to sound harsh, but we had seen interfaith done by older people, what I call tea and biscuit interfaith, where people sit around a table and talk, which was fine. But we had a sense of urgency that comes with being a young person, saying, well, there's so much need in the community. So I think the success is that they put young people in charge and focused on social action. And I think it's really important that these spaces begin to open up for the interfaith movement, because young people are in a super diverse world. It's no longer just about religious identity. There's a need to reconcile all of these different identities. And I think for young people, the space is needed to go through that process of reconciling and changing the conversation, and especially with issues over gender and sexuality diversity. I think that's the space where that can kind of begin to form new pathways or find new ways to kind of get over this clash or this feeling that, you know, religion and doesn't really mix with the modern world, or that kind of anti-religious sentiment that has kind of come up in with a lot of young people. And just as a to finish off, you also wonder, well, what does this mean for the future of interfaith? If this is going to be the upcoming generation who succeed all of these organisations, what's that going to look like? It's going to be much more diverse, much more outward looking, I think. But yeah, just to leave you on that note, and thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. That was really fascinating and very rich data right there. I can definitely see some parallels with the Gen Z study, like, you know, that totally informs. Thank you. Definitely went a lot quicker than I thought you would. So we will move on to the final presentation by Doug and Beck on legislation, I believe, anti-discrimination legislation.
Yeah, I'll share my screen, Enqi. So, great. Okay, hopefully everyone can see and hear that all fine. And as Jerry was saying, thanks everyone for being here on your Saturday afternoon. And perhaps thank you, Jerry, for going in quite quickly and buying me a little bit more time. So today I'm going to be talking about the legislation kind of stream of our project. And I'm going to be talking specifically about a paper that I've been writing with Doug and also with our colleague Laurie, who is based over in Canada. So talking about religious anti-discrimination legislation and the negotiation of difference in Victoria, Australia. Right. So essentially we are interested in the role of anti-discrimination and anti-vilification legislation in the negotiation of religious difference. And really we're particularly interested in how this process might look in the context of civil cases in Victoria. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about why civil cases and why Victoria. So we advocate for the importance of a relational form of negotiating religious diversity, and one that fosters respectful interactions between groups. So kind of one question of this is, what does sort of good, productive, respectful negotiation kind of even look like? What does that mean? And then for this part of the project specifically, one thing we've been really interested in is how legislation can support this kind of respectful negotiation of difference. And in doing so, we've been really drawing on concepts of etiquette and limitations, deep equality and substantive equality. So essentially, in terms of etiquette, I mean kind of like, you know, guidelines around how different groups should speak to and about each other in public forums. And placing limitations on hate speech as well, because we sort of feel like it's inevitable for sometimes there to be groups that just don't like each other, hate one another, will not speak kindly about one another. So where do we put limitations on these things? Also drawing on deep equality as well. So this comes out of Laurie's work as sort of a form of respectful engagement where everyday interactions can kind of foster feelings of similarity and familiarity, and respect is kind of found through those everyday kind of processes. And also substantive equality as well. So essentially, we kind of think that good negotiation of religious difference requires each of these elements. And what we're sort of arguing in this paper is really that legislation can implement or encourage these processes. So in answering this kind of broader question of how legislation supports this, you need to pay careful attention to kind of this wider social context, of course, and power dynamics of religious difference in Australia. So historical Christian privilege in Australia, as Gary sort of alluded to earlier, is really being challenged by the growth of increasing numbers of non-religious people, incredible diversity of minority religions in Australia, and also these kind of wider debates that we're all very familiar with around freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and also the provision of social services by largely Christian organisations using public funds. So it's kind of these wider debates and power dynamics going on, and legislation is, it's happening in that wider context and is responding to it as well. Okay, so in terms of the scope and methods for this particular part of the project, our work has been focused on the state of Victoria. So in Victoria, we've got the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, which hears cases of complaints about vilification, and also the Equal Opportunity Act, which is anti-discrimination legislation. So there is legislation, particularly for anti-discrimination, legislation across Australia. But the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act is actually quite a unique piece of legislation in Australia. And it's also, we think it's just really interesting that Victoria, has both anti-discrimination and anti-vilification legislation. That's so unique in Australia. So in Victoria, you have the Civil and Administrative Tribunal, or VCAT, which hears cases when people put forward complaints of vilification or discrimination. And attendance at VCAT is compulsory if you if you put forward a complaint or have a complaint made about you. So essentially for this paper, we examined all the cases from the implementation of the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act up until June 2018, I think it was. We examined the case law for every case dealing substantially with religion. And these cases are just publicly available through the OSLI database. So you can just search on through and read those. And we did a thematic analysis of all these cases. And just to see where we thought legislation was really interacting, interestingly, with negotiation of difference. So just there's two little sort of side notes. There has been one case of serious vilification charged under the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, and this is a criminal charge rather than a civil charge. So that wasn't heard at VCAT, it was heard at the Supreme Court, being a criminal charge. So we didn't include that in our analysis. And I think it's also worth pointing out that a lot of cases to do with religious difference that are heard at VCAT are actually heard under the Planning and Environment Act. So things like, people complaining about a mosque being built, for instance. So they would kind of bring these issues or tensions through under, planning and environment rather than, so because it's not being heard as discrimination or vilification, we didn't include that in the analysis, but I think it's worth sort of flagging as this really relevant, relevant part of what legislation kind of is dealing with and, here's. Okay, so I quite like this slide because it basically sums up our whole argument on one slide. So how does legislation inform, support, shape negotiation of difference? Our argument is that legislation, and in this case through VCAT, it does these things by mediating relationships between groups. And we think through VCAT, legislation mediates relationships in 3 ways. So firstly, we can kind of see this interventionist function. So this is where legislation kind of works as an intervention in cases of tension between groups. And this really relates strongly to the negotiation of power dynamics in Australia. It has this kind of transparency function where by hearing a case at VCAT, it really makes transparent these examples of latent and covert discrimination and exclusion. And VCAT also provides guidance about the management of religious difference in the public sphere. So I'll spend the next few slides just talking through each of these 3 kind of functions, giving case studies, so you can kind of see how this is playing out, how these processes are playing out. Okay, so firstly, we have the interventionist function. So again, this is intervention in cases of problematic tension between groups. And these are the cases where I think power dynamics are really relevant, because it's all about tensions between groups and groups' feelings and perceptions of other groups, and feelings of legitimacy, and potentially feeling like they are losing power and privilege that they have previously enjoyed. So these sorts of cases, you can kind of see this, it sort of often involves the product of Christians seeking to defend historic privilege that they've experienced in Australia. So a really good sort of exemplar of this interventionist function can be seen in the case of Islamic Council of Victoria versus Catchify Ministries. So this was quite a well publicised case because it went on for quite a long time and was, yeah, it was well publicised. So essentially what happened here was Catchify Ministries, which was run certainly at the time by Danny Nalia. So at a Catchify Ministries event and through a couple of publications, basically making comments that some Muslims who were present put forward a complaint saying that the descriptions of Islam, what was being taught about Islam at this event, was vilification. The first time round, VCAT agreed with Islamic Council and ruled that the Catchify Ministries had violated the Act. Catchify then appealed, and it was ruled in favour of Catchify, and in the end they ended up sort of sorting it out through outside tribunal mediation. So while this isn't sort of a really neat kind of conclusion to a case to analyse, I think you can really see that just by virtue of having the case heard and heard in the way that it is, really constrained public Islamophobic language. So acted as this way to intervene in the rising tensions and say, you know, this isn't okay language to use. And I think what's really key here is that it allowed the Muslims' concerns to be heard in a public forum, in a moderated forum. So it really intervenes in these rising tensions. And I think Dean's quote here is a really nice kind of illustration of this process. So they say the Muslim complainants didn't write anonymous death threats or start a riot. Instead, they went to the courts to modify behaviour they believed was dangerous and against the law. So yeah, really about intervening in tension. So this second function is around transparency, and this applies particularly in cases where exclusion happens but isn't as overt. So it might be cases of discrimination or exclusion where most people wouldn't necessarily be affected. Allows for sort of examination of internal processes of organisations and really allows for a reflection on how things have been done previously. So yeah, so it's in the cases of exclusion that maybe fly a bit under the radar. And the case of Aurora versus Melton Christian College is again a really nice exemplar of this function. So basically what happened in this case was parents, a Sikh family, they wanted to enrol their son at Melton Christian College. Their son has uncut hair and wears a pakka. And this head covering was against the Christian college's uniform policy. So, you know, schools end up saying, well, no, we can't that's not going to work because you need to conform to the uniform policy. The family has then taken Christian College to VCAT. And what was really interesting in this case was how it was really, really explicit in the case law when you read it, that the issue that VCAT kind of identified was that Sadak, the son, appeared non-Christian. So the school had already had other Sikh students enrolled, they had non-religious students, had Muslim students. So clearly the issue wasn't in enrolling non-Christian students. The problem only really kind of rose up when it was very obvious to look at someone that they weren't Christian. And VCAT, the judge in that case, really quite explicitly calls them out, saying that, you know, that's what the issue is here. That's not reasonable. You can't accept people on the basis that, well, they look like they could have, you know, could be Christian. And as a result of that case, the Christian College ended up changing their uniform policy. The boy was enrolled. So there's quite a nice sort of sense of reflection on behaviour, on policy, through drawing out those internal policies that maybe wouldn't have affected most students, and really, yeah, highlighting what was going on there and modifying how those groups related to one another. And finally, we have some, you can see how VCAT really, legislation through VCAT provides guidance around the management of religious difference in the public sphere. And this relates specifically, or mostly, to cases of groups requesting exemptions to the EO Act. So essentially asking for an exemption to you know, be able to breach, like, so do things that would ordinarily be counted as discrimination, but, you know, ask permission, basically. So there are some more complex kind of cases of this, particularly around, say, Christian organisations asking for exemptions to only hire Christians. And that sort of relates, again, what I was saying earlier about those kind of broader contextual kind of debates around social services. And I think there's probably, we need to think a bit more carefully about that. And there's probably some more clearer kind of etiquette and work that we need to do around that. But today I'm just going to focus just briefly on just simple cases. So basically, because these are really, they're much more common and very consistent. So essentially what this is usually just organisations go to VCAT, say, hey, can we have this temporary exemption to the EO Act to do things like running sessions for particular groups, particularly women. That tends to be what is involved in these cases. And so we've got like example here with Ascot Vale Leisure Centre. Yeah, it's a leisure centre. They wanted to run women's only swimming sessions. It's not always, or it's not, the reasoning in these cases isn't just about Muslim women, but that's a really consistent thread throughout these sorts of cases, that an organisation will have, you know, identified that there's Muslim women in the community that want to access this service but haven't felt that they can. So can we run women's only sessions? That's just like, it's really standard. That's typical what happens. And, you know, VCAT goes, yeah, that's fine. Like, it's straightforward. And in the kind of justifications from VCAT of why that discrimination should be allowable, they tend to use language such as tolerance, cohesion. They refer to like participation in the public sphere. So essentially saying things like, you know, yes, this actually, granting this exemption would be good for the EO Act because it would allow people from different groups to interact and get to know each other, have better understanding of each other. This will increase community and cohesion. It will, you know, take women or groups who are potentially at risk of social isolation and allow them to participate fully. So it's really quite consistent, these sort of keywords that VCAT hits on of how that sort of religious difference should be negotiated. And so, yeah, it really provides guidance around how that difference should be managed. And it's interesting too that in the way that VCAT talks about the public sphere, it's really assumed to be a secular space. Okay, so that is our three functions. Sorry about that. Okay, so finally, I just want to end on a couple of sort of notes about this. That really, I don't want to say that like legislation is some kind of, you know, panacea for how difference should be negotiated in Australia. So there are difficulties to this process as well. It's sort of an inherently oppositional process, this complaints-based model of VCAT. And as often becomes about this sort of balancing act, or at least perceived balancing act, between the right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the right to be free from discrimination. And there is probably concern that the fact that this is sort of an oppositional process could potentially reinforce tensions between groups. And legislation is certainly not accessible to all people. You know, groups really face a lot of barriers potentially to complainants face a lot of barriers. So either legal, but also social. So it takes a lot of time, a lot of money to pursue a case. You know, you need knowledge of your rights, knowledge of the legislation, access to legal counsel, and also like a lot of emotional energy, a lot of emotional labour goes into pursuing a claim. And this might not be feasible for groups or individuals who have already experienced marginalisation. So essentially, the relatively low number of cases heard at VCAT probably doesn't necessarily reflect that there are low levels of discrimination being faced in Victoria. So essentially, grain of salt about how impactful legislation is in the negotiation of difference and diversity. But there are things we think the legislation does well. Essentially, we believe that VCAT kind of provides a venue for minority voices to be heard respectfully. It illustrates kind of examples of discriminatory behaviour. So VCAT can kind of work to show what discriminatory behaviour actually is. So if you've experienced the same thing, you can look at that and go, okay, like a tribunal has said, that's not okay. So it certainly challenges this kind of historical privilege, and really, particularly through exemptions, facilitates these sort of everyday practices of equality and respect. So essentially, we sort of think that the legislation really functions in a way to mediate relationships and provide guidance about respectful communication between groups, but it does so without simply reaffirming the status quo of power relationships, power dynamics in Australia. And we think that, again, grain of salt, but I think that that is a really important function, and it's worth exploring further. Yeah, what role legislation plays in supporting this respectful negotiation of difference. So that is me.
Is that it?
Yeah, sorry, yep, that's all good, that's done.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if like that was going to be